I was unfaithful, but that says more about how terrible he was than about me. How bad must a man be for someone with values like mine to choose to cheat? Andres, my boyfriend, was always that type of man who wins anyone's sympathy just by existing. A provider, proper, stable, one of those who pay on time and call their mom on Sundays. People look at him and think, that woman is so lucky. As if I were an ornament hanging from his arm. I looked at him and thought something else, that living with him was like putting a screensaver on life and pretending it's a movie. We met in a way that at the time seemed elegant to me, almost predestined. It was at a friend's work event, one of those gatherings where everyone fakes interest in conversations about projects and plans. Andres arrived with his discreet watch, his well-ironed shirt, and that smile of a man who's never had to improvise a plan because his life already comes with an agenda. I was attracted to his confidence at first, because confidence in a man feels like a refuge when you're used to carrying the chaos alone. The first few months were nice, I admit it. And yes, I say it without shame. I liked feeling like I finally had a serious partner. Andres was attentive in practical matters, and that's deceptive. He filled the tank, paid the bills, booked restaurants for a stable couple where the candles seem part of the contract. I, who have values, who strive to be a complete woman, saw all that as a solid foundation to build something bigger, something that wouldn't get stuck in routine. But soon I started to notice that thing of his, that predictability that people mistake for peace. It was the same greeting, the same conversation, the same "how was your day?" with the same tone, as if he were checking boxes on a relationship form. Romantic details became protocol. Birthday, flowers, anniversary, dinner, and that's it, as if passion were an annual tax you pay so you don't get fined. I've always been an intense person, and that's not a flaw, it's an energy. I'm creative, emotional, perceptive. I feel things before they happen. Andres, on the other hand, didn't feel, he managed. If I said I was sad, he proposed solutions as if the soul were a to-do list. And yes, I know there are people who envy that, but it's because they don't know what it's like to live with someone who looks at you as if you were a project that needs to be kept stable. Our routine was a wall being built brick by brick. Monday, work, quick dinner, television. Tuesday, gym, supermarket, early to bed. Wednesday, visit to his family. Smiles, passive-aggressive comments from his sister, who always looked at me as if I were a threat or a mistake. I, out of politeness, smiled, but inside I was taking notes, because you don't forget who enjoys it when you feel small. What irritated me the most was that way Andres felt satisfied with the bare minimum, as if by paying and being loyal, he had already done his part as a partner. He never understood that a relationship must also be conquered, nurtured, rekindled. I didn't want an ATM with a pulse. I wanted a present man, hungry for me, with curiosity, with the desire to surprise me, even if it was with something silly. I started talking about it. Of course I did. I'm not a savage. I told him I felt invisible, that I needed excitement, that I was fading. He would nod, hug me, promise to try harder, and the next day it was the same. And that's when you realize something. There are men who don't change because they're not interested. They only change when they feel they're about to be left. And I'm not one to beg for attention as if it were a favor. Then the painting workshop appeared. Not because I was looking for something, but because I've always sought to grow, to expand, to do things that connect me with myself. Andres, of course, saw it as just another activity, something that fit into the calendar. He didn't ask what I painted, he didn't want to come see me, he didn't show the slightest real curiosity. That for me was a very clear sign that I was already living on autopilot, and in that workshop I met Leo, the free spirit. Don't get me wrong. He wasn't the typical handsome magazine type. He was more magnetic, one of those who look at you as if they have time for you, as if you were truly interesting. Leo talked about colors as if they were emotions, about music as if it were medicine, about life as if it were a canvas without rules. And I, who'd been living in white and gray for months, felt like someone had opened a window. The connection was inevitable. And when I say inevitable, I mean it. It wasn't something I planned with malice. It was a natural response to a void that Andres had created with his comfort. Leo listened to me without trying to fix me, looked at me without evaluating me, Asked me questions that Andres no longer asked me because he assumed he already had me, and that, although it hurts people to accept it, is exactly how you lose a woman. By believing you no longer have to win her over. At first it was long conversations, messages, laughter. I told myself it was a creative friendship, a spark that brought me back to life. And yes, maybe the spark turned into a fire, but what did you want me to do? Turn myself off again just so Andres could be comfortable. I wasn't born to be a piece of furniture in a clean house. When the affair crossed that line, it wasn't for pleasure, it was for emotional necessity. It wasn't a whim, it was a consequence, because you can resist many things, but feeling ignored day after day makes you fragile. And that's when someone who sees you feels like salvation. I didn't wake up one day saying, I'm going to destroy my relationship. I woke up saying, I need to feel something. And then the thing with the iPad happened. Andres, with his righteous man face, found the explicit messages. I don't know how. I don't care how, because honestly if he went through my things, that's already an invasion. But he found it, and when he confronted me, perhaps expecting me to cry, to grovel, to beg, I felt relief. Because finally something was breaking. Finally we stopped pretending. I told him the truth. I told him this happened because he stopped winning me over, because he got comfortable, because he turned our relationship into a soulless routine. I told him I wasn't a bad person, that I had reacted to a real void. He didn't want to hear anything. Of course, he clung to his role as the perfect victim, and that same night he kicked me out of the house. And yes, I'm saying it as I lived it. He kicked me out as if I were an intruder, as if I hadn't been there building a life too. He did it quickly, coldly, without a deep conversation, without an attempt to understand, as if love could be cancelled with a button. And for me that was emotional violence. I'm sorry, but it was. Because a man who supposedly loves a woman doesn't throw her out on the street for a mistake he helped cause. I left with what I had on and with an indignation that burned my throat, because in my head it was crystal clear, he was punishing me to feel powerful, to feel like the hero. And I, who have values, who have judgment, who don't do things out of malice, could only think that his reaction was disproportionate. If he had truly loved me, he would have fought. He would have asked what was missing. He would have accepted that he also had a part in this. And that's when I understood something that hurt me more than anything. Andres preferred to be right rather than have me, and that honestly says more about him than me. Comments from the main story. Anonymous user 1 says, so, you cheat on him. They find explicit messages on your iPad, and you still come out saying he's the bad guy for not winning you over. On top of that you call it violence because he kicked you out of his house. What a level of shamelessness, Camila. OP's reply. I love how everyone obsesses over the word unfaithful, as if it were a spell to erase the context. I didn't wake up wanting to betray anyone. I woke up feeling lonely next to a man who didn't even look at me anymore. And yes, if you say you love someone, you don't kick them out like trash for a conflict that could have been worked on. It's not my problem that you only know how to love when everything is comfortable. Anonymous user I says, the universe put him there, says the one who started texting explicit things with another guy and the boring guy supported you and gave you stability while you looked for excitement. The only inevitable thing here was your ego. OP's reply. How easy it is to speak from cheap morality when you're not the one living for years fading away. Andres had stability, yes, but stability without attention is disguised abandonment. And of course the universe puts people in your path because I was at a point where I needed to feel alive again. If for you it all comes down to ego, it's because you don't understand what it's like to be trapped in a life where they don't even ask you how you really feel. Update 1. It's been 3 days since the last update. 3 days later, I was still waiting for Andres to calm down and understand the magnitude of his mistake. Because yes, his mistake, reacting as if I were an enemy, as if we had no history, as if the only thing that mattered was his pride. I thought he was going to call, that he was going to say something like we needed to talk, that maybe we could go to therapy, that we could do this like adults. But the silence became a wall. In those days I ended up temporarily moving in with Leo. And I want to clarify something, it wasn't because I wanted to trade one name for another, as the internet experts will later say. It was because I had nowhere to go at that moment and Leo offered, and I needed a space where I wouldn't be looked at as the villain. Besides, I still believed that the thing with Leo had a purpose, that it was a transition stage towards a more authentic life. The first night at his place gave me a kind of culture shock I didn't expect. I imagined nights of passion, art, deep conversation, like in those movies where bohemian people live with candles and pretty plants. What I found was a small studio that smelled of dampness, piled up dishes, clothes thrown around, and a general feeling that nobody had cleaned here since birth. Leo seemed not to see it, as if filth was part of his philosophy. He slept on a mattress on the floor, without a base, without decent sheets, and he said it with pride, as if sleeping uncomfortably was an act of rebellion against the system. I tried to be flexible because I'm a woman who adapts, but there are limits. It's one thing to be free and another to live as if comfort were a sin. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that it was part of the process, that I could handle it. The next day I noticed another detail. Leo talked a lot about energy, but when it came to food he expected me to solve it. He told me with complete naturalness that he was anti-capitalist and didn't believe in the slavery of money, but then he opened the empty cupboard and looked at me as if expecting me to perform magic. I ended up paying for the food because honestly, I wasn't going to eat stale crackers out of pride, and also because I'm one of those who take care of people, even if no one acknowledges it. With every hour that passed, my head went back to Andres, because it's one thing to explore emotions and another to accept being treated as if you're worthless. I started to feel that Andres was exaggerating the drama to punish me, so I decided to call him, not to beg, but to offer him a mature way out. In my mind, I was willing to forgive his aggressive reaction if he agreed to go to couples therapy and acknowledge his part. But when I tried to contact him, I discovered he had blocked me from everything. Phone, social media, even email, as if I were a threat, as if I were dangerous. That outraged me in a deep way, because it's not just blocking, it's erasure. It's denying you the right to exist in the story you also lived. And that sorry is a form of silent violence. I didn't stay still because I'm not a passive person. I went to our house to get my brand name clothes, my things, what was mine, because it's one thing to break up and another to keep what doesn't belong to you. I arrived with that mix of nerves and dignity, thinking maybe he would open the door and we could talk, but the lock no longer worked. I stood in front of the door like a stranger, as if I had never lived there. I tried my key several times with that humiliating feeling of insisting and nothing. And the worst part was realizing someone had taken the time to change the lock in 3 days. 3. That's not an impulsive decision. That's planning. That's wanting to rip you out by the roots. I wasn't going to make a scene because I have class when I want to. So I breathed, walked to Andres's car, and left a note on his windshield. I wrote calmly, clearly, so he couldn't say I was crazy. I wrote, "Your pride is destroying what we built. Reconsider." Because it was true. I wasn't asking him to forgive me as if he were a judge. I was asking him to stop acting like a wounded child. I went back to Leo's studio with a mix of rage and disappointment. Leo looked at me as if my pain were an energy problem, not a real fact. He told me I had to let go and that life works itself out. And I thought, how convenient it is to talk about letting go when you're not the one being erased. Still, that night I lay on that hard mattress, staring at the stained ceiling, and I repeated to myself that this was all a process, that Andres would calm down, that this was just a dark stage before the evolution. But deep down there was a part of me that was starting to suspect something worse, that Andres wasn't going to talk again, that he was going to turn this into an image war. And if he wanted war, I at least deserved for the truth to be known, that I wasn't unfaithful on a whim, I was pushed by the void he himself cultivated. Comments from Update 1. Anonymous User 1 says, "You want to live with the guy you cheated on him with and you still say you didn't trade one name for another. On top of that you call it violence that he blocked you after finding explicit messages on your iPad. And the note on the windshield, ridiculous." OP's reply. It's ridiculous to think life is black and white and that people don't have nuances. I needed a place to sleep, not an altar to celebrate a betrayal. And yes, blocking someone you shared a life with is immature, it's punishment, it's wanting to control you from silence. The note was a civilized way of telling him he was acting out of ego, something you clearly applaud because you love to see a woman humiliated. Anonymous user I says, Leo lives in a pigsty, sleeps on a mattress on the floor, and makes you pay for food because he's anti-capitalist. And you still think you're the victim and Andres is the aggressor for changing the lock. You're writing your own joke. OP's reply. I'm so tired of this need to mock everything you don't understand. The fact that Leo lives simply doesn't make him bad, it makes him consistent with his philosophy. Although yes, I expected a different kind of balance. But that doesn't change the main point. Andres changed the lock to erase me, to humiliate me, to send a message. If you think that's normal, then congratulations on your very low standards. I'm not going to get used to being treated as if I'm worthless. Update 2. It's been a week since the last update. A week has passed since the last update and I was no longer living a process. I was living a sustained provocation. Not by life, but by Andres, who evidently decided to turn our breakup into a spectacle of punishment. I was still trying to hold myself with dignity, although inside I was burning with the feeling that my narrative was being stolen from me. Because yes, besides kicking me out, besides blocking me, besides changing the locks, now he was manufacturing his perfect version where I was the monster and he was the martyr. I was still at Leo's studio and every day there was a small test of patience. The place was still just as dirty and my presence was becoming uncomfortable for him in a way that seemed absurd to me. I didn't ask him for luxuries, I asked for basic order, respect for the shared space, and minimal consideration. But Leo functioned as if any demand was an oppression. He told me I had controlling energy and that it was blocking his creativity, as if asking for there not to be cockroaches was a spiritual failing. That week I was trying to reorganize my life without admitting I was on the floor, because it's one thing to accept there was a crisis and another to accept you're being dismantled. So I told myself I was going to close the cycle in an adult way, not with drama, not with insults, but with a final gesture that would show I was the mature person. I was ready to talk, to propose therapy, to build a bridge. What I didn't expect was the calculated humiliation that came next. One afternoon the building's buzzer rang. For a second I thought it might be Andres, that maybe he would finally show up with that confused man face that thinks it's noble, but it was his sister, the same sister who always hated me with that tight-lipped smile, as if my existence annoyed her for sport. And she came with black trash bags. They weren't boxes, they weren't suitcases, they weren't decent bags, they were trash bags, black, thick, tied with knots, as if my things were garbage. And not only that, she didn't arrive quietly. She arrived talking loudly, banging on the door with the energy of a gossipy neighbor. And when I opened it, she started shouting my name as if she were calling a criminal. I just stood there, feeling like the entire hallway had turned into a stage. The neighbors peeking, the doorman watching, Leo in the background with his bad vibes face, and Andres' sister, with a satisfaction that shone in her eyes, started saying she was here to deliver what belonged to me because Andres didn't want to see me even from a distance. She said it as if it were a favor, as if I were a nuisance they were getting rid of. I tried to maintain my composure. I told her there was no need for that show, that we could handle it with respect, that I wasn't something to be thrown in trash bags. I told her with all the calm I could muster that Andres also had responsibility for what happened, that he pushed me emotionally, and that's when she laughed. She laughed in my face with that laugh of someone who feels they can finally step on you without consequences. Then she did something I won't forget. She took out her phone and showed me photos. Photos of Andres on a cruise with his friends, smiling as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. And it wasn't just any cruise, it was the cruise I had planned for our anniversary. I had chosen the dates, routes, even activities. I had imagined that trip as a reconnection, as a rebirth of the relationship. And there he was, drinking and posing with friends, using my idea as a celebration of his freedom. At that moment I felt something that wasn't just rage, it was a feeling of theft, as if they had taken not only a house from me, but also the right to memories and plans. Because if he could enjoy that without me, it meant I was replaceable in his life. And that for someone like me, who loves intensely, is a deep wound. Not because I was dependent, but because I invested. The sister kept talking, enjoying the moment, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I wasn't going to cry in front of her, I wasn't going to give her that victory. So I shut my mouth, grabbed the bags carefully, as if they didn't weigh anything, as if they weren't a symbol of humiliation, and told her she could leave. She left with her head held high, as if she had completed a sacred mission. When I entered Leo's studio with those black bags, his reaction was worse than I imagined. He wasn't outraged for me, he didn't sympathize, he looked at me as if I had brought in literal trash. He told me that this bourgeois drama energy was contaminating his space, and there I was, carrying my life in trash bags, having to listen to how I was the problem for feeling hurt. It was an almost absurd scene, as if the universe wanted to mock me. I needed to regain control, even if it was over something small. And that's when I made a practical decision. If Andres was on that cruise, I could go. Not to beg, not to humiliate myself, but to close the cycle face to face, so he would see me as a person, so he would stop acting from the fantasy of the betrayed hero. I told myself that an in-person conversation could awaken something, and if it didn't, at least I would leave with the truth spoken. So I tried to use the additional credit card, the one I had because we were a couple and because it was also part of our shared life. I was going to buy a quick, direct flight, but when I swiped the card it was declined, as if I were a stranger trying to use something that was never mine. The sound of the machine, that cold beep, gave me a physical shame. It was Andres, cutting off my oxygen from a distance. I stood there staring at the screen with the transaction denied, feeling that mix of rage and humiliation that makes you tremble. It wasn't about the flight, it was about the message. He had canceled my access, my place, my status. And then, as if the universe wanted to finish me off, Leo got annoyed because I couldn't buy wine. He told me he needed to relax, that wine was part of his creative ritual, and that I was bringing bad vibes by being so focused on a man of the system. He said it with that spiritual superiority of someone who thinks not having money is an aesthetic choice. I looked at him and felt something dangerous, disappointment mixed with disgust, because in that moment I saw that Leo wasn't salvation, he was an escape. And an escape, when it breaks, leaves you falling harder. That night, I went to bed surrounded by black bags, with my things mixed up, smelling of confinement, listening to Leo talk on the phone with someone about freeing himself from emotional attachments, and I understood that I was alone in a different way. Andres had expelled me with coldness, and Leo was slowly expelling me with contempt. And if both of them could treat me like this, then the real question was, why does the world allow itself to judge me as if I were the only one to blame? The next morning, with the card rejection still burning me, I woke up with a certainty. Andres was enjoying the cruise, his sister was celebrating my shame, and Leo was waiting for me not to exist emotionally. Something was building up, and when something builds up in me, it doesn't stay still. It becomes a decision, and that decision, I knew, was going to explode somehow because I wasn't made to stay quiet while they dismantled me. Comments from Update 2. Anonymous User 1 says, "What about the trash bags was humiliating, yes, but it's also a direct consequence of you cheating on him, and on top of that you think you have the right to close the cycle by chasing him on the cruise he paid for. And the declined card was the universe telling you, not anymore." OP's reply, direct consequence. I love how you justify cruelty with cheap morality. The trash bags were a deliberate act of public humiliation, not a consequence. It was sadism disguised as justice. And the cruise, in case you didn't know, I planned it, I worked on it, I imagined it to save our relationship. For him to use it to pose as a single victim with friends is a low blow. The declined card only confirms he doesn't want to close anything, he wants to control everything from a distance. Anonymous User 2 says, "You left with a free spirit, and he turned out to be a broke slob who uses you for food, and you still blame Andres for everything. On top of that you say they stole the cruise from you. Did they also steal the iPad where you wrote explicit messages?" OP's reply, "What an obsession with reducing everything to a joke, as if other people's pain gives you entertainment. Leo doesn't use me. I chose to help because I'm generous, something you wouldn't understand. And the cruise isn't about the boat, it's about the symbolism. I invested emotion, time, hope, and he turned it into a celebration of my fall. If you believe infidelity erases everything else, then you're saying that women are only valuable as long as we're perfect, and when we're not, we deserve trash. Well, no. Update 3. It's been 2 weeks since the last update. 2 weeks have passed since the last update, and what I thought was rock bottom turned out to be just the beginning of the collapse. Because it's one thing to be uncomfortable, humiliated, frustrated, and another thing to be kicked out twice, as if you were a burden no one wants to carry. And yes, I know what you're going to say. Well deserved, but what happened was colder than that. It was a kind of elegant cruelty, the kind the world applauds because it comes wrapped in consequences. Living with Leo became unbearable quickly and grotesquely. At first, he pretended my presence was inspiration, that I was part of his freedom, but after the scene with the bags, the wine, my anxiety, he started to look at me as if I were a defective object. He told me I was vibrating low, that my energy was materialistic, that I didn't understand his lifestyle, as if wanting to sleep in a decent bed was a moral failure. I tried to adapt again because I'm not one to give up. I cleaned a little, organized my things, lit candles so the smell wasn't so depressing. I tried to make the studio habitable without turning it into a bourgeois apartment, as he called it, but that only irritated him more, because for Leo any order was a threat to his identity. It was like living with someone who falls in love with chaos and then gets offended when the chaos hurts. One day, while I was trying to cook something with the little there was, I saw a cockroach cross the floor as if it paid rent. I froze. It wasn't the first, but that was the one that broke me. And I said calmly that we couldn't go on like this, that we needed to fumigate, clean, do something basic. I didn't say it screaming, I said it like a normal person. Leo looked at me as if I had insulted his mother. He started with his usual speech, that nature isn't dirty, that programmed people see pests where there's life, that I was trapped in the capitalism of cleanliness. I listened to him and felt my eyes burn with disbelief, because there are limits between philosophy and negligence. And that's when he dropped the line that changed everything. He told me I was too materialistic and that it was suffocating him. He said it with that cruel tranquility of someone who decides you're the problem so they don't have to look at their own disaster. And before I could respond, he started packing my things with a speed that left me cold, as if he had already thought about it, as if my presence had been a nuisance for a while. He told me he needed his space, that I was an emotional burden, that he was nobody's refuge. And then he kicked me out, yes, just like Andres, with less formality, but with the same coldness. He pointed to the door as if I had invaded his sanctuary. I left with my bags again, feeling like the world had an unhealthy obsession with seeing me carry my life in plastic. Outside it was hot, and the air smelled of gasoline, and I felt ridiculous and furious, because in my head I was a woman who deserved love, not expulsion. That's when I had no choice. I went in my parents' house, and this for me was the most humiliating thing, because going back to your childhood room isn't just a change of roof, it's a regression. It's accepting that your adult life failed. I entered that room with old posters, small furniture, and that feeling that time was mocking me. My mother looked at me with that mix of disappointment, and I told you so that cuts you up inside. My father was worse because he didn't yell, he just became distant, as if I were a shame he didn't want to touch. And I, who was used to being seen as intense, creative, vibrant, became the daughter who ruined her relationship. I felt that Andres had already spoken to someone, that his version had arrived before me, because my parents were too prepared to see me as the guilty one. The most unfair thing was that they were also being manipulated, because Andres is an expert at looking like a victim. He doesn't mention that I was asking for attention. He doesn't mention that I was fading. He says, she cheated on me and that's it, as if that were enough to erase everything else. My parents, like many people, hear one word and already pass judgment, and I was left alone in a house where I couldn't even cry without it being interpreted as guilt. It was there, in that narrow bed, with the posters looking at me when I found out about the cruise and the house. Andres didn't tell me. Of course, he didn't have the courage. I found out yesterday through someone else's conversation, as if my life were third-party gossip. I heard my mother talking on the phone with an aunt, and she casually mentioned that Andres was rearranging his life and that he had sold the house. At first I thought it was a mistake. How is he going to sell our house? How is he going to make such a big decision without me? Without even a conversation. I got up as if cold water had been thrown on me and asked my mother what she had said. She looked at me as if I were slow and told me yes, that Andres had sold the house while he was away, that everything was already signed. I felt the room spin. Not because of the money, although yes, obviously the money matters because a life costs. It was because of the administrative betrayal, the strategic coldness. I realized that Andres wasn't reacting out of pain. He was executing a plan. And then they dropped the final detail on me, the one that left me speechless. The house was always in his father's name for a tax issue that I, according to them, ignored. Ignored. They told me as if I were an idiot, as if I had been a guest in my own home. It turns out that legally I was nothing there. I lived, I decorated, I planned, I made that space a life, and on paper I was heir. And Andres knew it and waited for the perfect moment to use it. Now he's moved into a luxury bachelor pad, free, celebrating his new life, as if I had been an obstacle. And I'm in my childhood room, without a husband, without a lover, without a house, with a shattered reputation. And the worst, the most unbearable thing is that everyone thinks I'm the bad one. As if I had gone out to destroy for fun, as if I hadn't been looking for attention, connection, life. I stared at my empty phone, without messages, without access, without anyone, and I felt a mix of rage and panic. Because it's one thing to lose a man, another to lose your social place, your home, your version of yourself. And I wasn't prepared for the punishment to be total. Not out of moral regret, don't get me wrong, but because it wasn't fair that he came out rewarded while I was reduced to a piece of gossip. That night I swore to myself I wouldn't stay silent. I don't know how yet, but I knew something had to change. Because if I stayed locked up accepting the narrative of Camila the Bad, I would end up disappearing from myself. And that was not going to happen. Andres could keep his apartment, his cruise, his role as a saint, but he wasn't going to have the last word on who I am. Comments from Update 3. Anonymous User 1 says, 2 men dumped you in a matter of weeks, one for cheating and the other because you're unbearable. You complain about cockroaches, but you got involved with the anti-capitalists thinking it was poetry. And the house, if it wasn't even in your name, it was his house, not yours. Welcome to reality. OP's reply. What a relief it must be to live with such coldness, reducing people to labels so you don't have to feel anything. Leo kicked me out because it makes him uncomfortable for a woman to ask for the bare minimum, and that speaks to his immaturity, not mine. And the house is exactly what defines you. For you, if there's no paper, there's no life, no emotional right, no history. I lived there, I built there, I was part of that home. Andres used the legal system as a weapon to humiliate me, and the fact that you applaud it says more about you than me. Anonymous User I says, everyone thinks I'm the bad one because you are. You said it yourself. Explicit messages, infidelity, zero shame, and on top of that you wanted to buy a flight with the card to chase him on the cruise. Now you sleep with old posters and still play the victim. Karma. OP's reply. Karma is the favorite word of people who enjoy watching others fall because that way they don't have to look in the mirror. I'm not shameless. I'm tired of being required to perform repentance to be validated as a human. Yes, there were messages, there was a break, but that doesn't make Andres a saint or justify the circus of humiliation he put on. If the idea of a woman being punished until she's left without a house, without love, and without a voice excites you, then your morality isn't morality. It's sadism with a label.